After these extravagant introductions, I am always reminded of President Lyndon Johnson, who after such an introduction would say that he was very grateful for that wonderful introduction. He just wished that his daddy and his mammy would have been there to hear it, because his daddy would have enjoyed it and his mammy would have believed it. In 1960, the commission charged by Pope John XXIII with preparing the Second Vatican Council sent a letter to all of the bishops of the world asking them what they thought should be discussed at what became the Second Vatican Council. Those answers, in the form of letters, form the first 5 or 6 volumes of the official acts of the Second Vatican Council, and they're quite interesting to read through. Many bishops imagined that Vatican II would be a kind of 3-month housekeeping operation in which minor matters of tweaking canon law, rearranging parts of the liturgical life of the Church, perhaps permitting some of the sacraments to be celebrated in vernacular tongues, would be accomplished, and then everybody would go home by Christmas 1962. My favorite among all of those submissions from more than 2,000 bishops came from the then Archbishop of Washington, Patrick J. O'Boyle, a native of Scranton, who spent a lot of his life in New York working on Catholic welfare issues during the Second World War. In any event, Archbishop O'Boyle sent in a laundry list of housekeeping chores he thought the council should take up, like many other bishops, but evidently had an advisor who thought he might look better if he put a large idea in this letter. So after the 7 housekeeping details, Archbishop O'Boyle wrote that the council should pronounce, in light of the doctrines of creation and redemption, on the possibility of intelligent life on other planets, which is even funnier in Latin than in English. And when I was working on Witness to Hope, I read this document in a Vatican archive, and I laughed out loud. And the archivist said, "What's so funny?" And I said, "Well, I've lived in Washington for close to 20 years, and if I were the Archbishop of Washington, the first thing I'd like to inquire about is the possibility of intelligent life in my own diocese before I started worrying about other planets." Of course, that was before Mr. de Blasio became mayor, so in the midst of all of those 2,000 letters, there came a very different kind of letter from a kid auxiliary bishop in Krakow named Karol Wojtyła, that probably no one in Rome had ever thought of since he had been named a bishop 2 years before. And he did not send a laundry list of church housekeeping chores for the Second Vatican Council to consider. He sent a philosophical essay. And the essay was built around the question, what happened? What had happened to the 20th century? A century that had begun 6 decades before with great confidence in the capacity of a maturing humanity, tutored by science, to build a nobler human future. What had happened, of course, were 2 world wars, the Cold War, oceans of blood, mountains of corpses, the greatest persecution of the church in history under communism, Auschwitz, the Gulag, the Ukrainian terror famine, that was the first 6 decades of the 20th century. What happened? And he proposed an answer to that question in this letter, this 40-year-old auxiliary bishop of Krakow. He said what had happened was that the idea of the human person, the idea of what it means to be a human being, had been grossly distorted over the past 300 years of history because the God of the Bible had been thrown over the side of history in the name of human liberation. And therefore, the council, he said, should restore the idea of Christ at the center of human history, Christ who reveals to us both the face of the Father of mercies and the truth of our own humanity. That was what the man who became John Paul II thought the Second Vatican Council should address. And you can see the imprint of that if you go to the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, paragraphs 22 and 24, which, interestingly enough, are the two most cited passages from the documents of Vatican II in the extensive magisterium of Pope John Paul II. In Gaudium et Spes 22, Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, paragraph 22, the Council Fathers teach, as I just said, that in the holy face of Christ, we see not only the face of the Father of mercies, we see the truth about our own humanity. Paragraph 24, the Council Fathers teach that it is only in a sincere gift of self that men and women come in to the truth about themselves and achieve genuine human flourishing and happiness. Why should we remember all of this? Why go through all of this afternoon? Because I think it helps us grasp why Karol Wojtyła, that young auxiliary bishop in 1960, took up the cause of Sister Faustina Kowalska during his time in Rome at the Second Vatican Council. I think it helps us grasp why he had his doctoral dissertation director, Father Rosicki, edit and study and retranslate Faustina's diary. I think it helps explain why the man who became Archbishop Wojtyła during Vatican II worked in Rome during the council to clear up misunderstandings about Faustina, her visions, and her diary. I think that story I just told helps us understand why John Paul II promoted devotion to the Divine Mercy throughout his pontificate. And finally, it helps us grasp why he wanted to celebrate the canonization of Sister Faustina as the first saint of the Church's third millennium. Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, who will be Pope St. John Paul II in a brief 3 weeks, had a keen personal sense of the tears, the rips, the rifts in the moral fabric of humanity that had been torn in that fabric during the 20th century. All of those terrible things I mentioned at the beginning. He had experienced those tears in the tapestry of humanity himself, especially in the cauldron of the Second World War, which, as I was preparing Witness to Hope, became clear to me, was the formative experience in the life of the man who became the priest who became the bishop, who became the Pope, we know as John Paul II. It's very difficult for Americans living on this side of the Atlantic in comparative safety, even during that period, to grasp just how awful the Second World War was in Poland. 20% of Poland's population in 1939, when the war began on September 1st, was dead when the war ended in the spring of 1945. For 5 years, Poland was under a draconian Nazi occupation, which was intended over time to eradicate the Poles as a race. For over 5 years, one of Karol Wojtyła's classmates once said to me, "It was not a question of knowing whether you would be alive at Christmas or Easter or on your next birthday. It was a question of not knowing whether you would be alive tomorrow morning." For several of those dramatic years, young Karol Wojtyła, the laborer who became a clandestine seminarian, walked home from the Solvay chemical factory where he was employed, past the convent at Łagiewniki, where Sister Faustina had died and was buried. Think of that in your mind's eye. Think of this handsome young man dressed in blue jeans and wooden clog shoes, in freezing weather, hungry, alone after the death of his father in February 1941, walking past Faustina's convent, perhaps stopping on his way to the factory or on his way home to pray in the chapel where St. Faustina is now buried. Think of that. Because I think if we remember that, we begin to understand that it eventually came clear to him that here was the answer. Here was the answer to all of the horrors of the 20th century that were being experienced in Krakow. As those horrors were being lived in a very dramatic way in his city, so was the answer to all of that suffering being offered in that city, offered in the experience of the divine mercy. That answer, which obviously grew in Wojtyła over the course of his adult life, but was surely planted in him during those war years. That answer stayed with him throughout his life. We see it at the very end of his life in what is perhaps the last remarkable teaching document of his pontificate, issued in 2003, called Ecclesia in Europa, the Church in Europe, which is really about the church in the Western world, the church in our part of the world. And in that document, written some 12 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when a new burst of hope had come over the world, John Paul II looked at what had happened in those intervening 12 years between 1991 and 2003, and noted the kind of thing that only he could note. He saw that for all that it seemed robust, economically healthy, full of vigor, the winner in the Cold War, the Western world was still burdened by a great sense of guilt. A great sense of guilt that reflected all of those awful things that humanity had done to itself in the first decades of the 20th century, and that continued in different forms, for example, in the abortion license, into the second part of the 20th century and into the 21st. A great burden of guilt, but as John Paul II asked in that letter, who can expiate that guilt? To whom can that sense of guilt be confessed? From whom can forgiveness be received? So that the people of the Western world can see a future different than the past that had been lived in such tears and sorrow in the 20th century. And here, I think, is the answer to why the man who will be in 3 weeks, Pope St. John Paul II, lifted up the divine mercy throughout his pontificate and put the canonization of St. Faustina at the very beginning of the Great Jubilee of 2000. John Paul II saw in Sister Faustina a messenger not only for Poland, but for the entire world. A messenger of the divine mercy, which was the answer to all of that suffering, all of that sorrow, all of those self-inflicted wounds in the moral fabric of humanity. There are other ways in which John Paul II's pre-papal life had prepared him to grasp this universal significance of Faustina's visions and the universal power of the message of divine mercy. His Polish heritage had taught him that history is best read theologically, that history is best read through lenses ground by biblical faith. His immersion, beginning as a young man during those war years, in the spiritual classics of the great Carmelite reformers, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, had nurtured in him a cross-centered spiritual life, so that he could say, at the beginning of the homily at the Mass at which Faustina was canonized on April 30th, 2000, these words: "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." So the Church sings on the octave of Easter, as if receiving from Christ's lips these words of the psalm. From the lips of the risen Christ, who bears the great message of divine mercy and entrusts its ministry to the apostles in the upper room. Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I send you. Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. Before speaking these words, Jesus shows his hands and his side. He points, that is, to the wounds of the Passion, especially the wound in his heart, the source from which flows the great wave of mercy poured out on humanity. From that heart, Sister Faustina Kowalska, the blessed whom from now on we will call a saint, will see 2 rays of light shining from that heart and illuminating the world. The 2 rays, Jesus himself explained to her one day, represent blood and water. Blood and water. We immediately think of the testimony given by the evangelist John, who, when a soldier on Calvary pierced Christ's side with his spear, sees blood and water flowing from it. Moreover, if the blood recalls the sacrifice of the cross and the gift of the Eucharist, The water in Johannine symbolism represents not only baptism, but also the gift of the Holy Spirit. Divine mercy reaches human beings through the heart of Christ crucified. My daughter, say that I am love and mercy personified, Jesus will ask Sister Faustina. Christ pours out this mercy on humanity through the sending of the Spirit, who in the Trinity is the person love. And is not mercy love's second name, understood in its deepest and most tender aspect, in its ability to take upon itself the burden of any need, and especially in its immense capacity for forgiveness? It was those nighttime readings in John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, that embrace of the cross as a young man, that led John Paul II to be able to preach those words some 55 years later. Moreover, his philosophical studies, Karol Wojtyła's philosophical studies, had led him to see that there is what he called a law of the gift, a law of self-giving built into the moral structure of our lives. We become the people we should be when we make our lives into the gift for others that each of our lives is to us. None of us is the cause of our own existence. We are all a gift, and that's not just an accident of biology. That tells us something about the nature of being human. That insight of reason for Wojtyła was confirmed by Christian faith, which sees in the self-giving of the cross against all the logic of the world. Christian faith sees in the self-giving of the cross the center of human history, not simply the tragic death of a good man. And because of the cross, history can be bent, directed in a more noble and humane direction by men and women who have experienced God's mercy in their lives, who have felt that divine mercy radiating out from the Sacred Heart, and who can therefore be messengers of the divine mercy for others. Pope Francis is another radical Christian disciple who has experienced God's mercy in his own life and wants others to have that same healing and salvific experience. That's why in his apostolic letter Evangelii Gaudium and in others of his writings, he's described, Pope Francis has, the Church of the 21st century as a kind of field hospital at the edge of a battlefield. What's the battlefield? The battlefield is the confused and broken and often death-dealing culture of our time. The walking wounded whom we all know, in our own families, among our neighbors, among our fellow citizens. Those walking wounded are those, Pope Francis tells us, to whom we must be the messengers of the divine mercy, both for their healing and because the experience of compassion, charity, mercy opens those walking wounded up to the truths that make for genuine human happiness, the truths that make for real human flourishing, the truths of biblical faith and the gospel of Jesus Christ. In this confused and broken world, Pope Francis is reminding us, witness comes before argument. Argument is important. People like me make a living making arguments. But witness is more important. Witness is more important. We invite people into an experience of the truth by an experience of the divine mercy radiating out of our own lives and touching theirs. And in all of this, Pope Francis is reminding us of themes taught by John Paul II, not least at that canonization of St. Faustina on April 30th, 2000. Here's another piece of that homily. Love of God and love of one's brothers and sisters are inseparable, as the first letter of John has reminded us. By this we know that we love the children of God when we love God and obey his commandments. Here the apostle reminds us of the truth of love, showing us its measure and criterion in the observance of the commandments. It is not easy to love with a deep love, which lies in the authentic gift of self. This love can only be learned by penetrating the mystery of God's love, looking at him, being one with his fatherly heart. We are able to look with new eyes at our brothers and sisters with an attitude of unselfishness and solidarity, of generosity and forgiveness. All this is mercy. To the extent that humanity penetrates the mystery of this merciful gaze, it will seem possible to fulfill the ideal we heard in today's first reading. The community of believers were of one heart and one mind. None of them ever claimed anything as his own. Rather, everything was held in common. Here, mercy gave form to human relations and community life. It constituted the basis for the sharing of goods. This led to the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Here, mercy became a concrete way of being neighbor to one's neediest brothers and sisters. We are living at a remarkable moment in the history of the Church. Catholic Church has been at the center of the human drama for almost 2,000 years. And in that period, over those 20 centuries, I think there have only been perhaps 4 other moments similar to the one in which we're living. A moment in which one way of being Catholic is giving birth to and giving way to a newer way of being Catholic. That happened when the early church of the Acts of the Apostles gave birth to and gave way to the Church of the Fathers, the Church of Ambrose and Augustine and Leo the Great and Gregory the Great, and all those figures we call the Fathers of the Church. That patristic church that they created, that way of being Catholic, eventually gave birth to and gave way to the Church of medieval Christendom, the Church of St. Thomas Aquinas, of St. Bonaventure, of Dominic and Francis of Assisi and Catherine of Siena. That church, in turn, after some 500 years, gave birth to, even as it gave way to, the mode of being Catholic, the way of being Catholic, in which all of us over 50 years old in this auditorium grew up, the Church of the Counter-Reformation, the Church of Charles Borromeo and Ignatius Loyola and Francis de Sales and Jean-François de Chantal, John Vianney, etc., etc., etc. That Counter-Reformation church is now giving birth to, even as it gives way to, what John Paul II called the Church of the New Evangelization. The church he described in such a powerful way at the end of the great Jubilee of 2000, when in the apostolic letter Novo Millennio Ineunte, entering the new millennium, John Paul II proposed as an image for the church in the 21st century the story from the 5th chapter of Luke's Gospel, where the Lord is standing on the beach. Apostles are out in the boat. They've been out all night. They're not catching anything. They come in. Lord says, "What have you caught?" They say, "We've caught nothing. We've had it. Enough. We're coming in." And he says, "No. Put out into the deep. Leave the shallow water, put out into the deep." That was John Paul II's metaphor for the church of the 21st century. We must leave the shallow waters, sometimes stagnant waters, of institutional maintenance and put out into the deep for a catch. And that image is addressed to all of us. For in the church of the new evangelization, each one of us is being asked to own our baptism as a baptism into a missionary vocation. When many of us were growing up, the missions were something far away. Exotic places to which brave men and women went, sometimes dying in particularly unpleasant ways for the sake of the gospel. But that was the missions. The missions were out there. The missions were those strange places you read about in National Geographic. John Paul II is saying to us, the missions are right here. And every one of us enters mission territory every day. At the breakfast table, with the neighbors, when we go to work, when we're consumers, when we act as citizens, it's all mission territory. And as we approach the renewal of our baptismal promises in 2 weeks at the Easter Vigil or at Easter Sunday Mass, when we don't say the creed, as you remember, we renew the promises of our baptism, and then we're blessed with Easter water, which is baptismal water. We should ask ourselves over these last 2 weeks of Holy Lent, have I been, this past year, the missionary disciple I was baptized to be? So that in affirming the truths of the faith, in the renewal of those baptismal promises, in receiving the blessing of Easter baptismal water, we can recommit ourselves to that missionary vocation into which we were baptized. Here's one more thing I might suggest to you along those lines. I can't really see the answer, so no one need be embarrassed. If you know the date of your baptism, raise your hand. That's about right, 2%. When you go home this evening, go to the file drawer where you keep all the Catholic stuff, pull out the baptismal certificate, and learn the date of your baptism. Learn the date of your baptism. Remember that when John Paul II returned to Poland for the first time in June 1979 and went to the town he was born in, Wadowice, 40 kilometers or so southwest of Krakow, and he went to the parish church across the street from the apartment where he had lived, what was the first thing he did? He went straight to the baptismal font and kissed the baptismal font. Why? Because he knew that was the day the divine mercy had entered his life. That was the day he received his commission to be a missionary disciple. That was the most important day of his life. Not the day he was ordained a priest, not the day he was consecrated a bishop, not the day he was elected pope. The most important day of his life was the day of his baptism. And that's a lesson for all of us. Sometimes when I'm meeting with our evangelical Protestant brethren, pro-life work, religious freedom work, I find that they have a very interesting way of introducing themselves at meetings. Most Americans introduce themselves at meetings by saying what they do. You know, I'm Joe Smith and I'm a lawyer, or I'm Mary Jones and I'm a librarian, or I'm Beth Atkins and I'm a pediatrician with 3 children, whatever. That's how Americans introduce themselves. Some of our evangelical friends will say, I'm Joe Smith and I was born again on such and such a date, when they're an adult, or I'm Mary Jones and I was born again on such and such a day. When I first heard this stuff, having a somewhat contrarian nature on occasion, I would say, well, I'm George Weigel and I was born again on April 29th, 1951, at which point I was precisely 12 days old. Interesting conversations about the sacrament of baptism began from there. But that experience said to me, I have to take the day I met the Lord sacramentally more seriously. I have to take April 29th as seriously as I take April 17th. That's a thought I commend to you. That's a thought I commend to you. Look up the date of your baptism and remember that that was the day on which you were commissioned to bring the divine mercy to others. This Church of the New Evangelization, Evangelical Catholicism, as I've called it in a book, proposes the gospel by example and by proclamation. If each of us is to live out that vocation of being a missionary disciple to which we were commissioned at baptism, we must be living witnesses to the divine mercy in all the facets of our lives. Our Catholicism, which flows like blood and water, like the Eucharist, like baptism from the Sacred Heart of the Merciful Lord, that Catholicism has to be, for each of us, more than a lifestyle choice, more than an ethnic identification marker. It has to be at the very center of our lives. And each of us must live the other facets of our lives around the radiating sun that is our faith. This is how we can convert those around us. This is how we can give our country, which badly needs it, a new birth of freedom rightly understood, freedom tethered to moral truth, freedom ordered to goodness. This is how we can heal the wounds of a broken and fractured world. This is how we can be that field hospital that Pope Francis calls us to be. It all comes from the crucified Lord and from the blood and water that flows from his side. Having washed over us on the day of our baptism, we are empowered to be the kind of missionary disciples that first generation of Christians was. Last thought about John Paul II. I've often said that the greatest line ever written about John Paul II was not, alas, written by me. I wrote lots of lines about John Paul II, but I didn't write the greatest one. Greatest line about John Paul II was written at the very beginning of the pontificate. On October 22nd, 1978, it was written by a French journalist, a man named André Frossard, who had grown up in the fashionable atheism of post-war Paris, who had come to faith as an adult, and who had been sent by his Parisian newspaper to Rome after October 16th to find out what on earth was going on with the election of this hitherto unknown Polish cardinal as pope. André Frossard stood in St. Peter's Square on October 22nd, 1978, saw this vibrant young pope preach, "Be not afraid, open the doors to Christ," wave that cross, that pastoral staff, like a great sword of faith. And he wrote back to his Paris newspaper, a story that began, this is not a pope from Poland, this is a pope from Galilee. That is what the 26 and a half years of John Paul II, at the center of which was the message of the divine mercy, that is what John Paul II is calling to each of us to do. To go to Galilee, to meet the risen Lord, to hear that great commission, and to go and convert the world by being messengers of divine mercy. Thank you very much.